work order printer in the boiler room never stopped making noise, clicking and spitting and sighing one sheet at a time, as if it had lungs it shouldn't have had and needed to prove it. The basement of the Larkspur Arms smelled like damp concrete and hot metal, a smell that climbed into your clothes in winter and stayed there long after you left. I finished every shift the same way, closed the loop in writing. Not because anyone asked. The portal kept its own logs, but I had learned the hard way that what mattered wasn't what happened. It was what survived on paper. The terminal was bolted to the workbench, old enough to flicker when it loaded the maintenance dashboard. I wiped the dust off the keys, hit enter, and waited for the system to tell me who needed heat and who could wait. The work orders were ordinary. Unit 3C, burner cycling too hard. Unit 1, A, filter replacement. Unit 2F, heat, intermittent, flagged high priority. I clicked each ticket, checked the notes, closed two that were already handled. Then I opened the third and saw the line that didn't belong. It wasn't the complaint. It wasn't the timestamp. It was the status label, printed in the same neutral font as everything else, as if the system couldn't tell the difference between a broken furnace and a broken person. No active living claim. I leaned closer until the pixels blurred, reset the page, loaded it again. The phrase stayed, sitting in the corner of the ticket like a quiet verdict. Below it were the usual fields: tenant name, unit number, contact preferences, Jenna Ruiz. Unit 2F, submitted through the tenant portal at 6:14 p.m. The system had accepted the request and then stamped her as if she had no standing to make one. Labels didn't appear by accident. Somebody had clicked something, somewhere, and the portal had learned a new way to say no. I backed out, searched the tenant list, pulled up 2F. The profile loaded slow, like it resented me for asking. In the occupancy field, a box was checked that I'd never noticed before. Inactive. Next to it was a drop-down menu with options that weren't written for humans. Moved, deceased, no claim, other. The highlighted choice was no claim, and beneath it, in smaller text, the system offered the same phrase again. No active living claim. A pipe overhead popped with expansion. The printer clicked and spat another sheet onto the tray. I didn't reach for it. My cursor hovered over, close ticket, above the terminal. A small dome camera watched the boiler room doorway. It didn't have a face, but it had a schedule. After-hours movement triggered automated notes, the kind that landed in someone else's inbox with my badge number attached. Closing the ticket would be easy. I could mark unable to access, like plenty of crews did when they didn't want to deal with a tenant who argued. The system would accept it. The label would stay where it was. Whatever no active living claim meant, it would keep meaning it. I clicked print. The printer shuddered, then delivered a single page with a ticket number, the time, the unit, and that line of text in the same indifferent typeface. I folded it twice and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, where I kept receipts and old permits. A stupid place to keep a thing. Also, the only place I trusted. On the screen, I hit acknowledge instead of close. The system logged my action down to the second. A small clock icon turned from gray to blue. It didn't fix anything. It did one narrow, defensible thing. It created a record that someone had seen the label and not looked away. I shut down the terminal and stood with my hand on the workbench, feeling the boiler cycle through the metal. Upstairs, a door closed. The sound traveled down the pipes like a message. No active living claim. I repeated it once in my head, not as a theory, just to keep the exact words from sliding away. The hallway to 2F smelled like cooking oil and wet wool. Salt from the sidewalk had been ground into the carpet. The lights buzzed, a thin electrical whine that never quite disappeared. I carried the printed ticket in my jacket like it had weight. I told myself I was going to check the radiator. That was true. I also told myself I wasn't going to get involved. That was the other truth I preferred. Unit 2F was a door with 3 layers of paint and a cheap brass number screwed on crooked. No notice taped to it. No padlock on the latch. I knocked once, then again, softer the second time, like I was trying not to leave evidence. After a pause, the chain slid and a woman's eye appeared in the gap. She looked past me down the hallway, then unhooked the chain. Jenna Ruiz was not a profile photo. She was a person in an oversized sweatshirt, hair pulled back too tight, skin around her mouth dry from breathing through it. The apartment behind her was dim, lit mostly by a space heater that wasn't strong enough to matter. A child's blanket hung over a chair. She told me the heat had been cutting out for 2 days. She said it like she'd already repeated it to someone who hadn't cared. She didn't mention notices or deadlines. She watched my hands instead. The way you watch a technician when you're not sure if the technician is allowed to help you. I kept my voice flat. I said I was there for the maintenance ticket and needed to look at the radiator and thermostat. I didn't ask why her account was flagged. I didn't read the label out loud. I didn't turn a system problem into a personal accusation in her doorway. Inside, the air had that edge of cold that tightens your throat. I could see my breath when I exhaled. The thermostat read 58. The radiator was warm in patches and cold in others, like a handprint that didn't cover enough surface. I crouched by the valve and listened. The pipe hissed, then fell silent. I tapped the metal with a screwdriver and felt the vibration die too quickly. The bleed screw was stripped. Somebody had tried to fix it before and given up. From the kitchenette, her kid coughed. A dry, tight sound that went on a beat too long. Jenna didn't look back. She kept her eyes on me, waiting for the verdict I wasn't supposed to deliver. There was a time I'd tried to help someone like that without putting it on the record. I'd told myself it was humane. That procedure could wait. The system hadn't agreed. It had crushed them anyway, cleanly, and then come back for me. I'd learned the lesson the slow way. Mercy without paperwork just made better evidence against you. I replaced the valve stem with a spare I carried for this building, wrapped the threads, opened it slow. Air spat out, then water. The radiator filled, the metal warming under my palm. A simple fix, the kind that would have felt satisfying on any other night. She nodded once, like we were both trying not to make a scene out of basic service. I asked, carefully, whether she had access to the tenant portal on her phone. She said she did, but it kept rejecting her login. She showed me the screen without handing it over. The way you show someone a bruise. A red banner sat at the top. Account inactive. Under it, smaller text, no active living claim. Seeing the phrase in her hand instead of on my terminal made something inside me shift. The system had reached through the wall and put its language in her pocket. Calmly, the way it assigned filter replacements. She asked what it meant. Not dramatically. Exhausted. The kind of question you ask when you've learned that inactive can turn into gone if you don't argue fast enough. I didn't answer it the way a lawyer would have. I told her I was maintenance and wasn't allowed to interpret account status. I said the building office handled that. I watched her face when I said it. The quick calculation of whether the office was even safe to approach. She asked if the heat fix would stick, like she was asking about more than heat. I said the radiator should run now, and if it didn't, she should submit another ticket. I heard how useless it sounded as soon as it left my mouth. Back in the hallway, I opened the maintenance app and added a note to the 2F ticket. Valve replaced. Heat restored. Tenant present at time of service. No opinions, no predictions. One checkable fact that contradicted inactive. The app spun for a second before it accepted it. A timestamp appeared under my note. The system had made room for my words. It could erase them later. By the time I got back to the boiler room, my hands had stopped shaking from the cold and started shaking from something else. The radiator in 2F ran steady. The pipes ticked as they warmed. Slow, metallic punctuation. The maintenance portal still showed my note. Time-stamped and neat. I should have felt better. I didn't. Outside the service door, the wind forced its way in through the gap at the bottom, carrying snow and exhaust. The alley was narrow and ugly. Dumpsters on one side, brick on the other. A security light buzzed overhead. My breath showed like smoke. I lit a cigarette, not for the nicotine. For the ritual, fire. Inhale, exhale. Something that obeyed physics. My phone vibrated. Then again. Jenna. The words were simple, procedural. The kind of question you could fix if you knew the right box to check. What does it mean? What do I do? My thumb hovered over the glass. I typed without thinking, felt the old reflex wake up, then stopped. Deleted. The phone was cold in my hand. The wind pushed at my coat. Somewhere above me, the dome camera held its red dot steady, patient as a timestamp. I typed again. Slower. Deleted. UPL. Unauthorized practice of law. 3 letters that sounded small until you watched someone lose everything over them. I'd crossed that line once. Off the clock. For the right reasons. The system hadn't cared about intent. Only records. I crushed a cigarette into the brick and felt the grit under my thumb. I typed again. This time like someone who still believed in consequences. I can't interpret that label. I'm maintenance. But keep screenshots of what the portal shows. Keep any papers they give you. Facts. Not strategy. I read it twice, listening for the way it might sound if it was ever read back to me by someone who wanted my job. I sent it. Another vibration. Is it bad? I started to type. Deleted? I knew the answer. I wasn't allowed to deliver it. I wrote instead, it matters because it's on the record. The record is what they use. So keep your copies. If anyone asks you to sign something, take a photo first. I hesitated, then sent it. The boiler clicked and took a breath behind the wall. Somewhere above, a door opened and closed. The building kept moving. I took screenshots of her messages and saved them into a folder labeled work orders, next to photos of rusted valves and serial numbers. If anyone ever asked, that's what they were. Maintenance documentation. I didn't add a note to the ticket. Dragging her question into the building's permanent trail would have turned it into leverage against her. I wanted proof she existed, not a record that could be used to erase her faster. I slid my phone back into my pocket and pulled the service door shut, making sure the latch caught. The metal made a hollow sound, final for something that could still be opened again. On the stairs, I repeated the phrase under my breath, not as an answer. As a warning I didn't know how to give. No active living claim. The leasing office opened at 9, but Elaine Price was there before the lights were fully awake. Her door was propped with a wedge, like nothing bad ever happened in a place that smelled that clean. I went up with my clipboard and the printed ticket folded in my jacket, riding the building's warmth up into the lobby air that never quite matched the rest of Larkspur Arms. Someone had plugged in one of those scent machines that puffed fresh linen every few minutes, and it didn't erase the old carpet underneath so much as sit on top of it like paint. The heat felt purchased. Elaine's office had glass walls and a desk that looked like it had never held a tool. A small fountain burbled in the corner. The sound was meant to be calming. It reminded me of a drain that didn't work right. She looked up from her monitor and smiled with the kind of ease you got when your job involved other people's problems staying on the other side of your desk, Cal. "Morning," she said. "I saw your note on 2F. Thank you for being responsive." I kept my voice flat. "Heat's back." Valve was stripped. She nodded, fingers already moving on her keyboard. Her nails were short, practical. Her screen reflected in her glasses like a second set of eyes. "You don't need to worry about Jenna Ruiz," she said, still smiling. "We got her situation sorted. Sorted. Like a stack of paperwork. Like laundry." Elaine clicked twice and turned her monitor slightly, just enough that I could see the tenant profile without seeing whatever else sat on her desktop. The same red banner I'd seen on Jenna's phone was gone. In its place was a pale gray line, "Unit vacate pending." Below that was a document icon. Elaine tapped it, and a PDF filled the screen. "This is what she signed," Elaine said. "Matter of fact, voluntary vacate. Mutual rescission. It's a clean way to resolve an arrear situation without, she made a small gesture toward the ceiling, as if court lived up there. On the page, the heading was in bold, "Voluntary Vacate Agreement." Under it, in smaller letters, it promised cooperation, dignity, and a mutual release. The language was soft. The effect was hard. Elaine scrolled to a paragraph and highlighted it with her cursor, like she was proud of the efficiency. Tenant acknowledges unit surrender as voluntary. Tenant waives any claim arising from occupancy. Tenant agrees to vacate by the date below. Then another line, confidentiality. I didn't need to read every word to understand the shape of it. It was an exit ramp built to look like a favor. What did she get? I asked before I could stop myself. Elaine's smile didn't change. Debt forgiveness. A waiver of the late fees. We're helping her avoid an eviction on her record. She said the last part like it was a gift. Honestly, it's the best outcome for her. For her. For them. For the building. A clean file was a clean conscience. My throat felt dry. The scent machine puffed again, trying to turn paper into cleanliness. My mind went back to my note from last night. Tenant present at time of service. A fact. Time-stamped. A counter record. In my head, it had mattered. Elaine clicked into another tab and the maintenance portal loaded inside her property management suite, nested like a child's toy. My note was there. She didn't even pause on it. Maintenance notes don't affect lease status, she said, as if she'd heard my thoughts through the glass. Different systems. Different workflows, she said it gently. She didn't need to be cruel. The machine didn't require cruelty to do its work. I watched the signature line on the PDF. Jenna's name was there, written in shaky cursive. Below it was a date and time. Above it was Elaine's neat typed name, as witness. There was also a checkbox. Tenant confirms they have not relied on any advice from property staff or third parties. A small clause that fenced off the entire world. Elaine printed the agreement with a quick tap. The office printer hummed once, smooth and confident, and delivered the pages face down like a secret. She slid them into a folder and snapped it shut. "Anyway," she said, bright again, "thank you for handling the heat. We'll be doing a unit walkthrough next week after she's out. I'll put in a ticket for you." She handed me the folder, not as a request, but as an instruction. The file was warm from the printer. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what the record would say when someone asked later. Voluntary. Mutual. Resolved. On my way out, I glanced at the reception counter. A bowl of mints sat beside a stack of blank forms. The mints were individually wrapped. All the same size, all the same flavor. I took one without thinking and tasted artificial sweetness as the door closed behind me. The folder under my arm felt heavier than any wrench. The last thing I heard was the soft clap of Elaine's filing drawer sliding shut, like a judge's gavel in miniature. I told my supervisor I had a dental appointment. He didn't ask what tooth. At my age, a dental appointment sounded more believable than anything else I could have said. The county courthouse sat on the edge of downtown like a block of damp stone. The parking lot was half-melted snow and gray slush, and people moved through it with their shoulders up and their eyes down. The building didn't look like justice. It looked like administration. Inside, the heat was too high and the air smelled like wet wool and old coffee. The floors shined with wax. A sign taped to the wall pointed to eviction court in black arrows, the kind you'd see at a conference center. I followed the arrows. The hallway narrowed and the sound changed. You could hear voices before you saw faces, low talk, quick questions, the scrape of shoes. A line of people stood against the wall holding folders and plastic grocery bags, each one carrying the sum of what they could prove. Most of them wore the same expression, braced. Not hopeful, not furious, braced. I took a seat on a hard bench at the back of the courtroom and chose the corner where no one would mistake me for help. I was a maintenance man in a work jacket, not a lawyer, not a volunteer. The only thing I had in my pocket that felt like power was a pen. The judge sat high at the front, not dramatic, just elevated. A clerk sat below, a stack of files beside her like feed for a machine. The bailiff leaned against the wall and watched the door, bored. Cases moved the way work orders moved through a portal. Call a name. Check a box. Next, Garcia versus Larkspur Holdings, the clerk said. A woman stepped forward. Her shoes were wet at the toes. She tried to speak, and the judge raised a hand without looking up. Do you have proof of payment? He asked. She fumbled a receipt. The judge glanced at it for half a second, then looked at the landlord's representative, a young man in a suit that fit like it had been borrowed. Plaintiff, payment was partial. The young man said, We're requesting possession. The judge nodded. Judgment for possession. The gavel didn't slam. The clerk wrote something. Next. Another name. Another folder. Another quick exchange. Default judgment. Continuance. Possession. The court wasn't cruel in the way movies liked. It was worse. It was efficient. I watched a man try to explain that his hours had been cut. The judge didn't react to the story. He reacted to the paperwork. When the man couldn't produce the right document, the story didn't exist. If it's not written, it didn't happen. I thought about Elaine's folder, warm from her printer, with the words voluntary vacate stamped on top like a brand. I thought about Jenna's shaky signature. If she signed, she didn't get to stand here and ask for mercy. The record had already decided for her. The landlord's representatives rotated through the room like shift workers. Some were attorneys. Some were not. They all spoke the same language. Dates, notices, amounts. They never used words like cold or child or cough. The tenant spoke in details the court couldn't file. A woman in a thrift store coat clutched a manila envelope to her chest. When her name was called, she stepped forward and whispered to the clerk that she didn't understand the papers she'd been given. The clerk leaned closer and said something I couldn't hear. The woman nodded like she'd been told the rules of a game after it ended. The judge asked, Did you sign a mutual rescission? The woman blinked. I signed something so they would stop calling. The judge looked down at the file and said, Almost bored. Then there's no controversy for the court. Next. No controversy. No living claim. My stomach tightened the way it did when a boiler made a noise you recognized too late. This wasn't about truth. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about what the system could process without slowing down. I stayed until my legs went numb and the docket ran thin. I didn't see Jenna. I didn't expect to. Elaine had built her an exit that bypassed this room entirely. The court would never know she had been here. The court would never know she had been alive in 2F last night when I tightened a valve and watched her kid cough. When the session ended, people spilled back into the hallway, clutching their folders tighter than before. Some were crying quietly. Some were making phone calls. Most were just moving, as if motion itself was a kind of denial. I walked out into the cold with my hands in my pockets and my breath coming fast. The courthouse doors shut behind me with a soft, heavy click. Fixing the heat had been honest work. You turned a valve. Air came out. Water came in. Metal warmed. The result was physical. This was different. This was paper-making reality. Standing on the steps, I understood something I hadn't wanted to understand in the boiler room. If I was going to fight, I couldn't do it with a wrench. I couldn't do it with a warm radiator. I needed a record the machine couldn't ignore. And I needed it before the system filed her out of existence. The boiler room welcomed me the way it always did, with heat that didn't feel like comfort. It felt like work. The air was damp and metallic, smelling of boiler fumes and old paper, and the pipes sweated into the concrete. The fluorescent light over the bench buzzed, flickered twice, then held. I put my clipboard down, ran my thumb over the greasy edge of the bench, and woke the terminal. The login screen bloomed into a pale blue rectangle in the dark while the terminal fan spun up with a thin whine, and the boiler cycled behind me like a slow machine, breathing a low inhale, a pause, then the click of a relay. I typed my credentials the way I always did, one letter at a time. The dashboard loaded. I went straight to the ticket list and filtered by unit. 2F. Nothing. I cleared the filter and tried again. Nothing. The ticket number from last night wasn't in open, wasn't in closed, wasn't in the recent pane. The system acted as if my hands had never touched that radiator, as if Jenna Ruiz had never existed as a service request. I checked my pocket for the folded printout anyway. It was still there, creased and warm from my body heat. I clicked into search, typed the ticket ID from the printout, and hit enter. No results. The portal offered a helpful suggestion. Try different keywords. That was how the system responded when you asked it for a person it had already decided not to see. Property software is built for managers, not mechanics. It shows what keeps rent flowing. It hides what would slow the work, but it can't hide everything. Not from itself. Every change has to land somewhere, because the first time it has to defend its own actions. It needs a trail. I clicked into an admin tab I wasn't supposed to use. It had been left visible after a training session months ago, the kind of oversight that only mattered when you noticed it. The tab was labeled Audit. Inside it was a search field and a calendar widget, and the layout was ugly, like it had been designed by someone who hated the idea of humans reading it. I set the date range to yesterday and today. Then I typed my own username. A list populated. Login. Log out. View ticket. Edit note. View tenant profile. All stamped down to the second. The mouse wheel made a dry, plastic rasp as I scrolled. The system remembered me even when it forgot the people I'd touched. I found it. Ticket 2F. Viewed 2148. Note added 2155. Tenant present at time of service. And then, 2 entries I hadn't made. Ticket 2F. Status changed. 2211. Modified by E. Price. Ticket 2F. Action. Sanitize. 2212. Modified by E. Price. Sanitize. Like blood. Like mold. Like anything inconvenient. I clicked the sanitize entry. A pane opened with fields that looked half empty on purpose. Reason code was set to resolved, off system. Visibility had been changed from tenant plus staff to archive only. A checkbox was ticked beside remove from standard views. The ticket hadn't been closed. It had been buried. I didn't touch anything. Touching was how you got blamed. Audit screens were the kind of place where a wrong click turned into a new timestamp, and timestamps turned into stories other people got to tell about you. I copied the audit row ID into a text file on the terminal. Then I copied it again onto paper with my own pen, pressing hard enough that the ink bit. At the bottom of the pane, a line of small text sat under the violence of the word sanitize. Retention bucket. Legal. Hold. 7 years. I read it twice. 7 years. The system's memory was longer than its conscience. I clicked legal hold. Another window opened, slow and reluctant. It showed a table, object ID, created, modified by. The hold reason was blank. The object ID was not. I wrote the object ID down. I didn't have access to open the file itself. Not here. Not with my badge. And I didn't need the content yet. I needed proof that a thing existed and that someone had tried to make it disappear. I opened my phone and took a photo of the screen. No flash. Just the blue rectangle. The audit lines. The words, modified by E. Price. Then I took another photo of the retention bucket line, close enough that the text would be legible later. I knew how logs died when you waited. Not dramatic, not with a bang. They got rolled up, compacted, replaced by normal operations, until the only thing left was the version that served the business. I logged out and shut the terminal down. Then I unfolded the printout in my pocket. No active living claim. That phrase was still there in ink. Not because the system wanted it to be, because I'd forced it into the physical world before it could be cleaned. In my hand, it felt like a ghost, proof of life that the portal had tried to kill. I folded it again and put it back where my heart could keep it warm. I kept the folder Elaine had handed me like it was contaminated. I didn't open it in the lobby. I didn't open it in the stairwell where cameras watched angles and shadows. I carried it down to the boiler room and slid it under the workbench, behind the spare valves and the box of damp filters, where paper went to rot. After my shift, when the building quieted and the tenants' televisions turned into a low, collective hiss, I came back down with a key ring and a flashlight. The boiler room light stayed off. I didn't need it. The less I looked like I was working, the more I looked like I belonged. I sat on the stool and pulled the folder out. The paper smell hit first. Fresh toner. Clean stock. The kind of paper that wanted to become a record and stay one. The agreement was 3 pages. The heading screamed voluntary vacate in bold, like volume made it honest. Beneath it, the language softened into velvet. Mutual. Cooperative. No admission. Dignity. I read it the way I used to read contracts when my name was still printed on office doors, line by line, letting the friendly words slide past until the structure showed itself. I was looking for the knife, not the ribbon. Tenant hereby agrees to surrender possession of the premises on or before. Mutual rescission. That was the phrase Elaine liked. It made it sound like 2 people shaking hands. It was a document built for one kind of person, the one with keys to the lock. A paragraph in the middle had been underlined in pen, probably by Jenna, probably because it sounded like relief. In consideration of the landlord's waiver of arrears and late fees, there it was. The trade. Silence for debt. Then the next sentence tightened. Tenant waives and releases any and all claims, known or unknown, suspected or unsuspected. Known or unknown. That was the part that always felt like theft dressed as certainty. It didn't just take what you had. It took what you hadn't learned yet. I kept reading. Confidentiality. Non-disparagement. No reliance. Tenant acknowledges that tenant has not relied upon any statement, representation, or advice. Advice. That word mattered. It was a fence built around the landlord, and it was also a fence built around anyone else who might try to help, because it turned help into liability. My mouth went dry, not from shock but from recognition, because I'd seen this style before. Not the words themselves, not exactly. The rhythm. Short definitions, broad waivers. Little phrases that sounded friendly until you tried to step out from under them, the kind of drafting that made judges tired before they even got to the argument. I flipped to the signature page. Jenna Ruiz. A date. A time. Elaine Price as witness. And a checkbox beside a sentence that looked harmless until you heard the courthouse in your head. Tenant affirms understanding. Understanding of what? Of the fact that the system wouldn't have to say eviction out loud. I rubbed my thumb along the margin, feeling the paper grain, and my hands remembered the weight of heavier files. The old conference rooms. The carpet that never smelled like anything real. The sensation of wearing a suit jacket and feeling like your body belonged to someone else. I hadn't written this specific agreement. I hadn't typed these exact lines. But I had written agreements that moved like this. I had argued waivers. I had explained, with a calm voice and a straight face, why mutual rescission was fair when the other side didn't have a choice. I swallowed. The boiler clicked behind me. Patient. For years, I'd told myself I'd gotten out in time, that I'd changed, that the things I'd done were contained in old cases and old clients, sealed away like closed files. But the language was still here, alive in my building, doing its work on a woman who couldn't keep her heat on. I set the agreement down and stared at the words like they were a mirror I didn't want. Shame wasn't a dramatic feeling. It was a practical one. It told you what you'd helped build. I pulled a notebook from my pocket, the one I used for valve sizes and parts orders. On a blank page, I wrote a list, not of emotions, but of clauses. Mutual rescission. Waiver known/unknown. Confidentiality. Non-disparagement. No reliance. Surrender date. Then I wrote, underneath, in smaller letters, leverage points. If the building wanted to erase people cleanly, it needed paper that looked voluntary. It needed signatures. It needed the court to see nothing but a record that said, no controversy, the court was a machine, and machines required inputs. I couldn't undo Jenna's signature. I couldn't practice law without hanging myself with those same clauses. But I could do what I'd always done. Back when I was paid for it, I could read the record until it showed me where it was weak. I took the copy of the agreement and slid it into a plastic sleeve from my toolbox. The sleeve was meant for wiring diagrams. It would do for this. Plastic kept paper clean. Clean paper lasted. The decision didn't feel heroic. It felt like admitting a disease you'd been pretending was a cold. If they wanted to play law, I could play procedure quietly. Precisely. With my hands still smelling like boiler metal. The next morning, the lobby looked brighter than it had any right to. Sunlight hit the glass doors and made the tiles shine. The scent machine puffed fresh linen again, trying to convince the air it had never touched damp carpet or old cooking grease, and the warmth in there felt staged the way a model unit felt staged. I came in through the service entrance and kept my eyes off the leasing office glass. My tool bag was heavy with wrenches and spare parts I hadn't needed in weeks, because weight was proof. A man carrying tools looked like a man doing his job. Elaine Price was waiting by the reception desk with a clipboard. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s. Clean boots. Jacket without a logo. The kind of person who never needed to crawl under anything. Elaine smiled like we were friends. "Cal," she said, "do you have a second?" I stopped where the camera over the lobby plant could see my whole face. I made my expression blank. Maintenance men got good at being harmless. "Morning," I said. "This is Mark," Elaine said, "Asset Compliance." Routine check-in. Mark held out his hand. His grip was firm and dry. He didn't look at my face when he shook. He looked at my badge. "Mr. Hart," he said, "we're doing workflow sampling. Making sure maintenance documentation aligns with policy. Aligns? Policy? Words with corners." Mark asked, "Your login activity spiked last night. After hours. Is there a reason you were accessing archived work orders?" My stomach dropped. But my voice didn't. I shrugged the way a tired man shrugged when asked about anything. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "I remembered I'd left a ticket open. I checked the portal. Logged out." Mark nodded like he believed me, which didn't mean he did. He wrote something down without looking at the paper. Elaine smiled wider. "We appreciate initiative," she said. "We also want to avoid irregularities." Irregularities. That was her version of sanitize. Mark continued, "We're also reconciling tool inventories. Mind opening your bag?" It was a request phrased like a favor. I set the bag on the tile and unzipped it slowly. Wrench. Adjustable spanner. Valve stems. Tape. Flashlight. Plastic sleeves. The folder was not in there. The printout was not in there. My phone stayed in my pocket. Mark looked, not for tools, but for absence. He didn't reach in with his hands. Instead, he pulled a slim stylus from his jacket pocket, the kind people used to tap glass screens, and used the tip to nudge my wrench aside as if metal carried a stain. He lifted a screwdriver by the handle with 2 fingers through his cuff, then set it back down like he'd touched something damp. He made a list. Elaine watched my hands. "Everything looks fine," Mark said after a moment. "Just need you to sign that you were present for the inventory review." Elaine flipped the clipboard around. A single page. My name pre-filled. Date and time. A signature line. I read the top line twice. Employee acknowledges that all access to tenant data is for operational necessity only. Operational necessity. A phrase designed to be vague enough to trap you later. I took the pen and signed anyway. Refusing would have been a flare in the dark. Mark took the clipboard back. Elaine's smile softened into something almost kind. "Cal," she said, "we rely on you. You do good work. We just need everyone to stay in their lane." There it was. The line again. Different context. Same fence. I nodded. "Yes." "Ma'am," I said, and added, "Sorry," as if the problem was manners. Elaine's eyes flicked to my chest pocket for half a second, then away. "No worries," she said. "Just be mindful, they left together." Mark walking half a step behind Elaine, like she was the one who owned the building and he was the one who kept the ownership clean. I picked up my bag and headed for the stairwell. My mouth tasted like yesterday's mint. Artificial sweetness overwrought. In the stairwell, the air was cooler. The lobby hum died. The building returned to pipes and distant footsteps. I checked my phone long enough to confirm the photos from last night were still there, then killed the screen before anyone could glance over my shoulder. Blue screen. Audit lines. Modified by E. Price. Retention bucket. Legal hold. 7 years. I slid the phone away and kept walking down. The building had noticed me looking back. It hadn't struck yet. It had only adjusted its posture, politely, like a hand settling on the small of your back to guide you toward the exit. By the time I reached the basement, the boiler room felt less like a workplace and more like cover. Upstairs, the glass lobby shone like a promise. Down here, the pipes kept their own truth, and now I had to move faster than their smiles. The change in the building didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with paper. When I came in that morning, the leasing office door was shut, not propped with the friendly wedge. Shut. The blinds were half drawn on the glass walls, as if sunlight counted as a witness. The scent machine still puffed fresh linen, but the air underneath it had a new bite. Warm plastic. Hot toner. A faint sharpness like ozone, the way a copier smelled when it ran too long. I didn't go in. I wasn't supposed to. I walked past with my tool bag and kept my pace even, the way you did when you knew someone had changed the rules and you didn't want to be the first person they tested them on. Through the gap in the blinds, I saw movement. Elaine's silhouette. Another shape I didn't recognize. A man in a suit, shoulders squared, holding a folder like it was a shield. The printer in the corner of the office was going hard, spitting pages into a tray that no one had time to straighten. On my phone, the maintenance app pinged, "System maintenance tonight, 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Limited access. That notice wasn't for tenants. It wasn't for me. It was for whoever needed a reason to touch the database without looking like they were touching it. Downstairs, the boiler room was the same as always. Damp concrete, low heat, the hum of the machine doing its honest work. I set my bag down, checked the pressure gauge, logged a routine reading, and waited for my hands to stop feeling like they belonged to someone else. My supervisor's voice came over the radio. "Cal? You around? I'm here," I said. "Need you to stay available. Office might call for support." Support. That was the word they used when a problem moved above your pay grade but still needed someone to carry boxes. I walked the basement loop, checked the sump pump, and counted seconds in my head. Every few minutes, the building above me made a sound that didn't belong to pipes, the metallic rasp of a shredder, faint but steady, like someone sawing through thin wood. Shredders have a rhythm. You can tell when they're eating envelopes and when they're eating contracts. The boiler kept its own rhythm under it, a steady hum that didn't care what names were on paper. Upstairs was panic made into strips. Down here was heat made into fact. I went up one level and paused outside the back stairwell door that led to the office corridor. The air was warmer there. I could hear the copier. I could hear a phone ringing and being answered too fast. I could hear the kind of quiet that wasn't calm. The kind of quiet that meant everyone had agreed, without saying it out loud, not to be the person who asked the wrong question. A sheet of paper lay on the floor near the mail slots, freshly dropped and stepped on. It had the building letterhead at the top and a barcode at the bottom. Someone had printed it and lost it, which told me more than the words did. I picked it up with 2 fingers and read the subject line. Notice of data preservation. Legal hold. Below it, in tighter type, was a phrase I hadn't seen in years without getting paid. You are hereby instructed to preserve all records, communications, and electronically stored information relating to. The next line was cut off where the paper had torn, but I didn't need the rest. Legal holds didn't show up for routine management. In the margin, someone had circled a date in pen. Response due, 10 business days. 10 days. A clock, not hung on a wall but dropped into the building's stomach, and I could feel it in my pocket like weight. It wasn't a number that lived on a calendar. It was a deadline with edges. My pulse slowed the way it did when you finally knew what kind of storm you were in. This wasn't an argument. This was process. The building had been touched by an outside hand, and the first thing it did was lock down its memories. I folded the page once, then again, and slid it into my jacket pocket behind the printed ticket. Paper next to paper. 2 ghosts, both insisting they had once been real. Back in the boiler room, I sat on the stool and looked at the concrete floor until the hum of the boiler stopped feeling like noise and started feeling like cover. They knew the request had landed. They were scrambling to decide what the record would say when someone else asked to see it. And that scramble was familiar. I'd sat in rooms where people spoke softly and moved quickly and called it risk management. I'd watched them rename panic into procedure. A legal hold meant someone had pulled a lever outside the building. It meant the system couldn't delete everything without leaving fingerprints. It meant there were now rules. Written rules. About what had to survive. But rules didn't make people honest. Rules just made them careful. 10 business days. I said it once under my breath, like a part number. If I could stay standing until that deadline hit, the building's clean story might crack. And if I couldn't, the record would close over Jenna's name like wet cement. Elaine didn't summon me with a radio call. She did it the way a polite person does when they want you to feel chosen. A calendar invite hit my phone just before lunch. Check-in, 30 minutes. Location, leasing office. The invite came from her address, not from management, as if it was personal. I wiped my hands, put my wrench back in the bag, and went upstairs at exactly the time listed. Being late was one kind of guilt. Being early was another. I aimed for neutral. Elaine's office looked the same as always. Glass walls. Fountain burble. The desk cleared like nothing had ever been signed on it. But the air felt warmer than usual, like she'd turned the heat up to make the room feel safe. A paper cup of coffee waited on the corner of the desk. Black. No lid. My name written on the side in careful print. Cal, I wasn't sure how you'd take it, Elaine said. Smiling, figured you'd tell me if it was wrong. I didn't touch it. I sat in the chair across from her, the one with the soft seat that made you sink a little, like the room wanted you to relax into agreement. Elaine folded her hands. I'm going to be blunt, she said. We've had some external attention. It happens. It's not the end of the world. She didn't say FOIA. She didn't say legal hold. She didn't say Jenna's name. She spoke in the same language as the agreement. Broad. Soothing. Designed to cover sharp edges. I value you, she continued. You've been steady. Competent. You don't gossip. You don't make problems. I kept my face blank. I fixed things. I said, that's exactly it. Elaine leaned forward, just a fraction. We're growing. We need people who understand how systems work from the inside. Facilities isn't just pipes anymore. Cal. It's compliance. Documentation. Risk reduction. Risk reduction. The words landed like a hand on my shoulder. She slid a folder across the desk. Neat and new. A printed label on the tab read, Consultant Agreement. You've got experience, she said. Perspective. I think you'd be an asset in a broader role. Higher pay. Better benefits. Pension protection. More control over your schedule. The offer was wrapped like a gift. Underneath it was the question, will you stop looking? I opened the folder with my fingertips. The paper was thick. Corporate stock. A signature page waited at the back, already flagged with a yellow sticky tab. I started at the beginning anyway. Definitions. Scope. Duties. The language was smooth, professional. Then I hit the section titled Confidentiality. My eyes recognized the rhythm before my brain finished the sentence. Employee agrees to keep confidential any and all information relating to tenant status, subsidy programs, internal scoring, occupancy determinations, living claim, without the words. Next paragraph, non-disparagement. The same velvet trap. You could speak, technically, as long as what you said never produced consequences. Then, release. Known and unknown. The old knife. A line farther down made my throat tighten. Employee acknowledges that employee has not relied on any statement or representation. No reliance. Elaine's favorite fence. I didn't need to read every clause to know what the contract was. It wasn't a promotion. It was a seal. A clean record that said Cal Hart had agreed, voluntarily, to be quiet. Elaine watched my eyes, not my face. She could tell where I was on the page. It's standard, she said. Soft. It protects everyone. It keeps things from being misunderstood. Like Jenna's existence was a misunderstanding. I looked up. How long is the confidentiality term, I asked. Elaine's smile stayed in place, during employment and after. Indefinite. Effectively. That's typical indefinite. Another way to say forever. The temptation arrived in my body, not my thoughts. The promise of sleep. The promise of safety. Then I saw, clear as a stamped seal, Jenna's signature on her voluntary exit. I closed the folder gently. I appreciate it, I said, truly. But I'm not your guy for that. Elaine's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Why not? I shrugged. Small. Harmless. Maintenance, I'm better with pipes, I said. You don't need me in a suit. You need me in a basement. Her smile thinned. Not anger. Calculation. We can adjust the paperwork, she said. Make it more comfortable. That's kind of the point, I said. Then softened it. I don't want to waste your time. Elaine tapped the sticky tab on the signature page without opening the folder again. Think about it, she said. No rush. Then she added, like she was giving me a favor instead of a deadline. If you want the pension protection piece, it needs to be signed by close of business today. End of shift. Clean cutover, no rush. But the clock had a time on it. I stood, nodded, and left the coffee untouched. In the hallway, the building felt less like cover and more like a mouth closing. I didn't burn a bridge. I just refused to step onto it. And I knew, walking back toward the basement, that refusal had been recorded. The letter was waiting in the slot under the office door, the one that ate rent checks and complaints. Plain envelope. No logo. My name printed in the same font they used for late fees. I didn't open it right away. I stood in the basement corridor and listened to the boiler cycle, that steady on-off rhythm that made the whole building feel like a machine with lungs. And when I finally tore the flap, the sound felt too loud for the space. Inside was one page. 3 tidy paragraphs. A signature block that looked like it belonged on a warranty card. It thanked me for my service. It told me that, due to operational restructuring, my position was being eliminated. It made the timeline clean and surgical, effective immediately, keys and access returned by end of shift. No accusation, no argument, no mention of what I'd done or what I'd seen. Just whether this is happening. Plan accordingly. I folded the page and slid it into my shirt pocket like it was something I wasn't allowed to drop. Upstairs. The lobby was too clean. Citrus cleaner. Fake cedar. The same music that sounded like a waiting room pretending not to be a waiting room. Elaine's office door was shut, but a thin strip of light ran under it. The building had been in quiet crisis mode since the external request landed. You could hear it in the small changes, Screens angled away. Conversations clipped short. People smiling too hard. I'd caught a subject line once on a monitor somebody forgot to lock. Legal hold. Do not alter. Then it was gone. That wasn't justice. That was a clock. I went back down because the basement was the only place where the rules were still honest. Heat rises. Water follows gravity. A valve either turns or it doesn't. I started in the supply closet off the basement corridor, the one that smelled like bleach and rust. My box was a recycled copier box with legal hold, faintly visible under the marker someone had used to cross it out. I packed my life into a container that used to carry someone else's panic. I didn't take much. A set of nut drivers worn smooth at the handles. My flashlight. A dented thermos. A small notebook with grease on the corners. The building would replace all of it. It could buy tools the way it bought silence. The keys were the heaviest thing. A ring that looked ordinary until you held it long enough to feel what it meant. Master to the mechanical room. Master to the roof hatch. Fire panel cabinet. The basement gate that stuck in winter. Each key had a shape in my palm, a pressure point I could find without looking. I kept setting them down and picking them up again, like my hand didn't believe it was done. Before I turned them in, I went to my station one last time. The terminal sat on the same bolted desk, blue light washing my hands. I logged in and pulled up the maintenance portal. Slow blocks of interface loading like reluctant admissions. Requests. History. Unit 2F. The work order that pulled me into Jenna Ruiz's hallway was there, but it didn't look like the thing I remembered. It looked calm. Closed. Resolved. Service complete. No tag. No special status. No warning phrase. In my world, she'd been alive in a doorway, wrapped in a blanket, telling me she wasn't dead with the kind of careful tone people use when they think volume can trigger consequences. In their world, she'd been a line item. Now even the line item had been sanded. I opened the audit view, the ugly one that made normal staff nervous. It took extra clicks and a warning banner that asked if I was sure. I was sure. Modified by a service account with a string of numbers. Modified reason. Data normalization. A marker buried in a field the portal didn't display unless you exported. Expunged. Legal hold applied. There was the truth of it. The system could hide things from humans, but it couldn't erase the fact that it had erased. I didn't export anything. I didn't email myself a screenshot. I took an HVAC invoice from my pocket and wrote down 4 items in block letters. Expunged. Sanitized. Legal hold. Modified by service account. Paper didn't ask to sync. Paper didn't leave access logs. I searched for the phrase that had started all of this. No active living claim. Nothing. I searched for living claim without the no. Nothing. I searched for her name. The portal offered me 4 Jenna Ruizes in the city and none in my building. The cleanest kind of disappearance is the one that looks like it never happened. That was what a settlement bought. Not a fix. A patch. Make the specific instance safe to show to a third party. Then move on. Jenna's tag was gone. Not because anyone had grown a conscience, but because the tag had become a liability. My letter belonged to the same category, resolution. A human problem converted into a clean administrative output. I sat there with the boiler humming behind me and the blue screen in front of me, and I understood something that would have sounded dramatic if I'd said it out loud. The system hadn't lost. It had learned. I logged out. I wiped the monitor with my sleeve, not because it mattered, but because I didn't want to leave a smudge shaped like panic. Then I carried the box upstairs, turned the keys over at the reception desk, and listened as the drawer closed with a small, Final click. My last hour in the building wasn't dramatic. Nobody marched me out. Nobody raised their voice. The end came the way most things came here, quietly, in writing, with the lights staying on, as if nothing had changed. I walked back down to the basement because it was the only place that felt honest to me. The air got colder by the step. The hum of the boiler got louder, until it filled the space the way a voice would fill a room if it was allowed. At my station, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. The paper was there, stacked and folded and ugly. Not the portal. Not the audit view. The physical things I'd made when the digital world tried to pretend Jenna Ruiz didn't exist. The HVAC invoice with the block letters. The maintenance log page where I'd written "Tenant present at time of service," the words pressed deep enough to leave an imprint on the sheet below. A copy of the work order printout from before it got sanded. The one I'd pulled when the system still forgot to hide itself. Not a screenshot. A page I'd printed on their own cheap toner, in their own font, before the patch made it disappear. Paper was stubborn. It held the moment you touched it. I could have taken it with me. That would have been the instinct, back when I still wore a tie and thought possession was the same as protection. But paper in my apartment would turn into a liability the first time somebody decided to be curious. If they wanted to search me, they could make a reason. Burning it would have been cleaner. Burning always looks like closure. Instead, I did what I'd always done here. I maintained. In the boiler room, there was a control panel on the east wall with a screwed-on plate nobody opened, unless something failed hard. Behind it, insulation was packed tight, and the pipe run disappeared into a cavity that wasn't meant to be accessed. I took a screwdriver from my pocket and set the tip into the first screw head, feeling the metal bite as I turned it slow. 1/4 turn. Another. The screw loosened with a soft grit sound, like the building didn't want to give anything up, and I set it carefully on the concrete where it wouldn't roll. The second screw fought more. I adjusted my grip and leaned into it until it gave, then did the same with the others, counting the turns without meaning to, because counting was what you did when you were trying to keep your hands steady. When the last screw came free, I lifted the plate away. It came off with a soft metal sigh. Warm air breathed out of the gap, carrying that familiar mix of hot water and old iron. I slid the papers inside, wrapped in a plastic parts bag to keep off moisture. I didn't label them. Labels were invitations. I pushed them back far enough that they wouldn't fall out if someone opened the panel in a hurry. Then I put the plate back. I started each screw by hand, just enough to catch the threads, and tightened them in a slow pattern so the plate seated flat, turn by turn, until my wrist ached and the metal stopped shifting under pressure. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't evidence in a courtroom. It was a physical record the system couldn't overwrite with a patch. A landmine, but only for someone willing to look. I stood there with my hands on the plate, feeling the vibration of the pipes through metal. They thought maintenance meant fixing. Mostly, it meant noticing, and keeping things from collapsing. I hadn't fixed the building. I hadn't saved Jenna. I hadn't broken the algorithm. I had kept a record alive long enough to prove it had existed. When I walked back up, I took the stairs instead of the elevator. The hallway was empty. Unit doors sat in their frames like sealed envelopes. Somewhere behind one of them, a television murmured. Somewhere else, a faucet dripped. The building went on. At the front entrance, cold air rushed in around the glass as someone left. I stepped out and let it hit my face, sharp and clean. The street smelled of exhaust and winter and damp leaves. My breath came out in a cloud and vanished. Behind me, the building stood tall and lit, a machine doing what it had been designed to do. I turned away, and the door latched itself shut with the soft final sound of a record being filed.